All right. Hey, everyone. Happy. Well, it's Wednesday now. It's that time of week. Time for Lovecraft, and hopefully, I did some editing of this PDF to censor out all the N bombs and replace it with gentlemen's. As after last week's incident with the rats on the walls, but I only passingly know what the Call of Cthulhu is about. It's I think I might have read a few pages of it like decades ago, but I've never read the full story itself. I, of course, know what Cthulhu is because it's hard not to, but let's just jump into it. This is The Call of Cthulhu, written by H.P. Lovecraft in 1926. Get some water for a start. Alright. Yeah. There we go. Okay. There may be a few typos or such from my editing work because I had to export it to Microsoft Word, then export it again to PDF. So there may be a few things here, like I think there's supposed to be a space trade nautical and looking there. Little minor formatting issues like that may crop up. But let us begin. Found among the papers of the late Francis Wayland Thurston of Boston. Of such great of such great powers or beings, there may be conceivably a survival of a hugely remote period when consciousness was manifested, perhaps in shapes and long forms, since withdrawn before the tide of advancing humanity. Forms of which poetry and legend alone have caught a flying memory and called them gods, monsters, mythical beings of all sorts and kinds. Algernon Blackwood. Part 1. The Horror in the Clay. Or the Horror in Clay, not no the. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but some day their piercing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. If this was written after World War II, I would assume he's talking about the atom bomb. Actually, this was written in the 1920s when, what was the word for the fear of technocracy was a thing? Because that's where the black and white movie Metropolis came from, if I remember right. It might have been later than the 1920s, but that was a thing back then. Where they feared technocracy, where it's just everyone would become slaves to the machines and stuff like that. That might be an aspect, part of the themes here. I'm not sure. Theosophists, theologians is the correct word there. Theosophists have guessed at the awesome grandeur of the cosmic cycle wherein our world and human race form transient incidents. They have hinted at strange survivals in terms which would freeze the blood if not masked by bland by bland optimism. But it is not from them that there came the single glimpse of forbidden aeons, which chills me when I think of it and maddens me when I dream of it. That glimpse, like all dread glimpses of truth, flashed out from an accidental piecing together of separated things. In this case, an old newspaper item in the notes of a dead professor. I hope that no one else will accomplish this piecing out. Certainly, if I live, I shall never knowingly supply a link in so hideous a chain. I think that the professor, too, intended to keep silent regarding the part he knew, and that he would have destroyed his notes had not sudden death seized him. My knowledge of all the thing, my knowledge of the thing began in the winter of 1926 to 27, with the death of my granduncle, George Gamble Angle. Okay. Gamble Angle, Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. Professor Gamble Angle was widely known as an authority on ancient inscriptions and had frequently been resorted to by the heads of prominent museums, so that his passing at the age of 92 may be recalled by many as an old-ass age for back then. 92? Damn. Locally, interest was intensified by the obscurity of the cause of death. The professor had been stricken whilst returning from the Newport boat, falling suddenly, as witnesses said, after having been jostled by a nautical-looking gentleman. I'll let you guess what word that is. A nautical-looking gentleman who had come from one of the queer dark courts, dark courts on the precipitous hillside, which formed a shortcut from the waterfront to the deceased's home in William Street. Physicians were unable to find any visible disorder, but concluded after perplexed debate that some obscure lesion of the heart, induced by brisk ascent of so steep a hill by so elderly a man, was responsible for the end. At the time, I saw no reason to dissent from this dictum, but laterally, I am inclined to wonder, or more than wonder. As my granduncle's heir and executor, Taro Dune, for he died a childless widower, I was expected to go over his papers with some thoroughness, and for that purpose moved his entire set of files in boxes to my quarters in Boston. Much of the material which correlated will be later published by the American Archaeological Society, but there was one box which I found exceedingly puzzling, and which held much of verse from showing to other eyes. It had been locked, and I did not find the key till it occurred to me to examine the personal ring, which the professor carried always in his pocket. Then indeed, I succeeded in opening it, but when I did, so seemed only to be confronted by a greater or more closely locked barrier. For what could be meaning of the queer clay bas relief? Brass relief? Clay bas relief in the disjointed jawlings, ramblings, and cuttings which I found. Had my uncle, in his latter years, become credulous of the most superficial impostures, I resolved to search out the eccentric sculpture responsible for this apparent disturbance of an old man's peace of mind. Current Invisalign braces I'm on is really messing with my speech. As is life. Guess it is just bas relief. Or maybe bas relief, I don't know. The bas relief was a rough rectangle, less than an inch thick, and about 5 by 6 inches in area. Obviously of modern origin. Its designs, however, were far from modern in atmosphere and suggestion, for although the vagaries of cubism and futurism are many and wild, they do not often reproduce that cryptic regularity which lurks in prehistoric writing. And writing of some kind of bulk of these designs seems certainly to be, though my memory, despite much familiarity with the papers and collections of my uncle, failed in any way to identify this particular species, or even to hint at its remotest affiliations. Above these apparent hieroglyphics was a figure of evidently pictorial intent, though its impressionistic execution forbade a very clear idea of its nature. It seemed to be a sort of monster, or symbol representing a monster, of a form which only a deceased fancy could conceive. If I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yielded simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, I shall not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing. A pulpy, tentacled head surmounted a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings, but it was the general outline of the whole which made it most shockingly frightful. Behind the figure was a vague suggestion of a cyclopean architectural background. The writing accompanying this oddity was aside from a stack of press cuttings in Professor Mangle Angle's most recent hand. It made no pretense to literary style. What seemed to be the main document was headed Cthulu Cult, in characters painstakingly printed to avoid the erroneous reading of a word so unheard of. The manuscript was divided into 2 sections, the first of which was headed 1925, Dream and Dreamwork of H.A. Wilcox, 7 Thomas Street, Providence, Rhode Island. And the second, Narrative of Inspector John R. LaGrasse, 121 Beanville, Saint. Sorry, Beanville Street, not Saint. New Orleans, Louisiana, at 1908 AS Management Montgomery MTG. I don't remember what that stands for. Doesn't matter. Notes on the same in Professor Webb's account. The other manuscript papers were all brief notes. Some of them accounts of the queer dreams of different persons. Some of them citations from theological, whatever, books and magazines. Excuse me. Notably W. Scott Eliot's Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria. And the rest comments on long-surviving secret societies and hidden cults, with references to passages in such mythological and anthropological source books as Fraser's Golden Bough and Miss Murray's Witch Cult in Western Europe. The cuttings largely alluded to outre mental illnesses and outbreaks of group folly or mania in the spring of 1925. Roll my neck for a second there. The first half of the principal manuscript told a very peculiar tale. It appears on that March 1st, 1925. A thin, dark young man of neurotic and excited aspect had called upon Professor Angle, bearing the singular clay bas-relief, which was then exceedingly damp and fresh. His card bore the name of Henry Anthony Wilcox, and my uncle had recognized him as the youngest son of an excellent family, slightly known to him, who had laterally as in formerly, or laterally, whatever, been studying sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design and living alone at the Fleur-de-Lis building near that institution. Wilcox was a precocious youth of known genius for great eccentricity, there we go, and had from childhood excited attention through the strange stories and odd dreams he was in the habit of relating. He called himself psychically hypersensitive, but the stad folk of the ancient commercial city dismissed him as merely, he is using that word a lot, never mingling much with his kind. I know queer means something different back then, but it's using it a lot. Never mingling with much of his kind, he had dropped gradually from social visibility and was now known only to a small group of aesthetes from other towns. Even the Providence Art Club, anxious to preserve its conservatism, had found him quite hopeless. On the occasion of the visit, ran the professor's manuscript, the sculptor abruptly asked for the benefit of the host's archaeological knowledge in identifying the hieroglyphics on the bas-relief. He spoke in a dreamy, stilted manner, which suggested pose and alienated sympathy, and my uncle showed some sharpness in replying, for the conspicuous freshness of the tablet implied kinship with anything but archaeology. Young Wilcox's rejoinder, which impressed my uncle enough to make him recall and record it verbatim, was of a fantastically poetic cast, which must have typified his whole conversation, and which I have since found highly characteristic of him. He said, "It is new indeed, for I made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than brooding Tyre, or the contemplative Sphinx, or garden-girdled Babylon." Garden-girdled. You really stretched that word out. There's supposed to be a hyphen there. It was then that he began that rambling tale, which suddenly played upon a sleeping memory and won the fevered interest of my uncle. There had been a slight earthquake tremor the night before, the most considerable felt in New England for some years, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. Upon retiring, he had an unprecedented dream of great cyclopean cities, of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror. Hieroglyphics had covered the walls and pillars, and from some undetermined point below had come a voice that was not a voice, a chaotic sensation which only fancy could transmute into sound. but which he attempted to render by the almost unpronounceable jumble of letters. Cthulu Fatagan. Fatagan. Gotta get that Bostonian accent there. Fatagan. This verbal jumble was the key to the recollection, which excited and disturbed Professor Angle. Good old Mangle Angle. He questioned the sculptor with scientific minuteness and studied with almost frantic intensity the bas relief on which the youth had found himself working, chilled and clad only in his night clothes. When waking had stolen bewilderingly over him, my uncle blamed his old age. Wilcox afterwards said, for his slowness in recognizing both hieroglyphics and pictorial design, many of his questions seemed highly out of place to his visitor, especially those which tried to connect the latter with strange cults or societies, and Wilcox could not understand the repeated promises of silence which he was offered in exchange for the admission of membership in some widespread mystical or paganly religious body. Was hell of a run-on sentence. When Professor Mangle Angle, I gotta stop saying Mangle. That's just too funny. It makes me laugh each time. When Professor Angle became convinced that the sculptor was indeed ignorant of any cult or system of cryptic lore, he besieged his visitor with demands for future reports of dreams. This bore regular fruit, for after the first interview, the manuscript records daily calls of the young man, during which he related startling fragments of nocturnal imagery whose burden was always some terrible cyclopean vista of dark and dripping stone, with subterranean voices or intelligence shouting monotonously in enigmatical sense impacts, unsubscribable save as gibberish. Uninscribable, not unsubscribable. Uninscribable save as gibberish. The two sounds most frequently repeated are those rendered by the letters Cthulu and Riley. On March 23rd, the manuscript continued. Wilcox failed to appear, and inquiries at his quarters revealed that he had been stricken with an obscure sort of fever and taken to the home of his family in Waterman Street. He had cried out in the night, arousing several other artists in the building, and had manifested since then only alternations of unconsciousness and delirium. My uncle at once telephoned the family, and from that time forward kept close watch of the case, calling often at the Taylor Street office of Dr. Toby, whom he learned to be in charge. The use febrile mind, apparently, was dwelling on strange things, and the doctor shuddered now and then as he spoke them. Not a very good doctor, just giving up everything. Maybe there wasn't doctor-patient confidentiality back then in the 20s. Was I? They included not only a repetition of what he had formerly dreamed, but touched wildly on a gigantic thing, miles high, which walked or lumbered about, but at no time fully described this object. He, not B. But occasionally frantic words, as repeated by Dr. Toby, convinced the professor that it must be identical with the nameless monstrosity he had sought to depict in his dream sculpture. Reference to this object, the doctor added, was invariably a prelude to the young man's subsidence into lethargy. His temperature, oddly enough, was not greatly above normal, but his whole condition was otherwise such as to suggest true fever rather than mental disorder. On April 2nd, at about 3 p.m., every trace of Wilcox's malady suddenly ceased. He sat upright in bed, astonished to find himself at home and completely ignorant of what had happened in dream or reality since the night of March 22nd. Pronounced well by his physician, he returned to his quarters in 3 days, but to Professor Angle, he was of no further assistance. All traces of the strange dreaming had vanished with his recovery, and my uncle kept no record of his night thoughts after a week of pointless and irrelevant accounts of thoroughly usual visions. Here, the first part of the manuscript ended, but references to certain of the scattered notes gave me much material for thought, so much in fact that only the engraved skepticism, then forming my philosophy, can account for my continued distrust of the artist. The notes in question were those descriptive of the dreams of various persons. That was a hard to say sentence, hard to parse. Covering the same period as that in which young Wilcox had had his strange visitations. My uncle, it seems, had quickly instituted a prodigiously far-flung body of inquiries among nearly all the friends whom he could question without impertinence, asking for nightly reports of their dreams and the dates of any notable visions for some time past. The reception of his request seems to have been varied, but he must, at the very least, have received more responses than any ordinary man could have handled without a secretary. This original correspondence was not preserved, but his notes formed a thorough and really significant digest. Average people in society, in business, New England's traditional salt of the earth, gave an almost completely negative result, though scattered cases of uneasy but formless nocturnal impressions appear here and there. Always between March 23rd and April 2nd, the period of young Wilcox's delirium. Scientific men were a little more affected, though 4 cases of vague description suggested fugitive glimpses of strange landscapes, and in one case, there is mentioned a dread of something abnormal. It was from the artists and poets that the pertinent answers came, and I know that panic would have broken loose had they been able to compare notes. As it was, lacking their original letters, I half suspected the compiler of having asked leading questions, or of having edited the correspondence in corroboration of what he had latently resolved to see. That is why I continued to feel that Wilcox, somehow cognizant of the old data, which my uncle had had been imposing on the veteran scientist. These responses from the aesthetes told a disturbing tale. From February 28th to April 2nd, a large portion of them had dreamed very bizarre things, the intensity of the dreams being immeasurably the stronger during the period of the sculptor's delirium. Over a fourth of those who reported anything reported scenes and half sounds not unlike those which Wilcox had described. Some of the dreamers confessed acute fear of a gigantic nameless thing visible toward the last. One case, which the note describes with emphasis, was very sad. The subject, a widely known architect with leaning towards theology, and occultism, went violently insane on the date of young Wilcox's seizure and expired several months later after incessant screamings to be saved from some escaped denizen of hell. Had my uncle referred to these cases by name instead of merely by number, I should have attempted some corroboration and personal investigation. But as it was, I succeeded in tracing down only a few. All of these, however, bore out the notes in full. I have often wondered if all the objects of the professor's questioning felt as puzzled as I did this fraction. It is well that no explanations shall ever reach them. The press cuttings, as I have intimated, touched on cases of panic, mania, and eccentricity during the given period. Professor Angle must have employed a cutting bureau, for the number of extracts was tremendous and the sources scattered throughout the globe. Here was a nocturnal suicide in London, where a lone sleeper had leaped from a window after a shocking cry. Here likewise, a rambling letter to the editor of a paper in South America, where a fanatic deduces a dire future from visions he has seen. A dispatch from California describes a theologist colony as donning white robes en masse for some glorious fulfillment which never arrives, whilst items from India speak guardedly of serious native unrest towards the end of March. Do orgies. Okay. Multiply in Haiti. I don't think Lovecraft quite knew how to spell that. And African outposts report ominous mutterings. American officers in the Philippines find certain tribes bothersome about this time, and New York policemen are mobbed by hysterical Levantines on the night of March 22nd to 23rd. The west of Ireland, too, is full of wild rumor and legendary, as a fantastic painter named Ardoy Banal hangs a blasphemous dream landscape in the Paris Spring Salon of 1926. And so numerous are the recorded troubles in insane asylums that only a miracle can have stopped the medical fraternity from noting strange parallelisms and drawing mystified conclusions. A weird bunch of cuttings, all told, and I can, at this date, scarcely envisage the callous rationalism with which I set them aside, but I was then convinced that young Wilcox had known of the older matters mentioned by the professor. That was the dense first part. We got through it though. Not entirely sure where this is going. Obviously, there's some kind of mass hallucination going on with Cthulhu. Oh, alright. Part 2. The Tale of Inspector Legrasse. The older matters, which had made the sculptor's dream in Bastardy so significant to my uncle, formed the subject of the second half of his long manuscript. Once before, it appears, Professor Angle had seen the hellish outlines of the nameless monstrosity, puzzled over the unknown hieroglyphics, and heard the ominous syllables, which can be rendered only as Cthulhu. And all this in so stirring a connection, that it is small wonder he pursued young Wilcox with queries and demands for data. The earlier experience had come in 1908, 17 years before, when the American Archaeological Society held its annual meeting in St. Louis. Professor Angle, as befitted one of his authority and attainments, had a prominent part in all the deliberations, and was one of the first to be approached by the several outsiders who took advantage of the convocation to offer questions for correct answering and problems for expert solution. The chief of these outsiders, and in a short time the focus of interest for the entire meeting, was a commonplace-looking middle-aged man who had traveled all the way from New Orleans for certain special information unobtainable from any local source. His name was John Raymond Legrasse, and he was by profession an inspector of police. With him, he bore the subject of his visit, a grotesque, repulsive, and apparently very ancient stone statuette whose origin he was at a loss to determine. It must not be fancied that Inspector Legrasse had the least interest in archaeology. On the contrary, his wish for enlightenment was prompted by purely professional considerations. The statuette, idol, fetish, or whatever it was, had been captured some months before in the wooded swamps of South New Orleans during a raid on a supposed voodoo meeting. Okay. And so singular and hideous were the rites connected with it, that the police could not but realize that they had stumbled on a dark cult, totally unknown to them, and infinitely more diabolic than even the blackest of African voodoo circles. Real classic New Englander racism going on here. Okay. Of its origin, apart from the erratic and unbelievable tales extorted from the captured members, absolutely nothing was to be discovered, hence the anxiety of the police for any antiquarian lore which might help them to place the frightful symbol, and through it track down the cult to its fountainhead. To be fair, it isn't really just a New Englander thing, because Robert E. Howard, who wrote the Conan series, had a borderline fetish, but he definitely had a fixation on African culture and stuff like that, where he would use it for his stories that were before Conan. Where was I? Fountainhead? I think it was at Fountainhead. Inspector Legrasse was scarcely prepared for the sensation which his offering... Oh, I should also say that Robert E. Howard is from Texas, so that's why I said it wasn't specifically a New Englander thing. Sorry, anyways. Inspector Legrasse was scarcely prepared for the sensation which his offering created. One sight of the thing had been enough to throw the assembled men of science into a state of tense excitement, and they lost no time in crowding around him to gaze at the diminutive figure whose utter strangeness and air of genuinely abysmal antiquity hinted so potently at unopened and archaic vistas. No recognized school of sculpture had animated this terrible object, yet centuries and even thousands of years seemed recorded in its dim and greenish surface of unplaceable stone. The figure, which was finally passed slowly from man to man for close and careful study, was between 7 and 8 inches in height and of exquisitely artistic workmanship. It represented a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and forefeet, and long, narrow wings behind. This thing, which seemed instinct with a fearsome and unnatural malignancy, was of a somewhat bloated corpulence, and squatted evilly on a rectangular block or pedestal covered with undecipherable characters. The tips of the wings touched the black edge of the block, the seat occupied in the center, whilst the long, curved claws of the doubled-up, crouched hind legs gripped the front edge and extended a quarter of the way down toward the bottom of the pedestal. The cephalopod head was bent forward, so that the ends of the facial feelers brushed the backs of huge forepaws which clasped the croucher's elevated knees. The aspect of the whole was abnormally lifelike, and the more subtly fearful because its source was so totally unknown. Its vast, awesome, and incalculable age was unmistakable. Yet not one link did it show with any known type of art belonging to civilization's youth, or indeed to any other time. Totally separate and apart, its very material was a mystery, for the soapy, greenish-black stone, with its golden or iridescent flecks and striations, resembled nothing familiar to geology or mineralogy. The characters along the base were equally baffling, and no member present, despite a representation of half the world's expert learning in this field, could form the least notion of even the remotest linguistic kinship. They, like the subject and material, belonged to something horribly remote and distinct from mankind as we know it. Stumbling over all these words is thirsty work. Something frightfully suggestive of old and unhallowed cycles of life, in which our world and our conceptions have no part. Also, this is an interesting parallel to Robert E. Howard. I think this was written before Conan, because Conan was written in the 30s, I think, and this was 20s. What we read in last month of Conan had some of this pre-man alternate evolution stuff going on, which I think this is hinting at, or suggesting at least. And yet, as the members severally shook their heads and confessed defeat at the inspector's problem, there was one man in that gathering who suspected a touch of bizarre familiarity in the monster's shape and writing, and who presently told with some diffidence of the odd trifle he knew. The person was the late William Channing Webb, professor of anthropology in Princeton University, and an explorer of no slight note. Professor Webb had been engaged 48 years before in a tour of Greenland and Iceland in search of some runic inscriptions which he failed to unearth, and whilst high up on the West Greenland coast had encountered a singular tribe or cult of degenerate Eskimo? Wow, that is one hell of a typo for Eskimo. Okay. I don't think they have Eskimos in Greenland. Eskimo or Arctic Canada in Alaska, right? Okay. Eskimo. Whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled him with its deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. It was a faith which other Eskimo knew little, and which they mentioned only with shudders, saying that had come down from horribly ancient aeons before ever the world was made. Besides nameless rites and human sacrifices, there was certain queer hereditary rituals addressed to a supreme elder devil, or Tornasuk. And of this, Professor Webb had taken a careful phonetic copy from an aged Angkok, or wizard priest. expressing the sounds in Roman letters as best he knew how. But just now of prime significance was the fetish which this cult had cherished, and around which they danced when the aurora leaped high over the ice cliffs. Was, the professor stated, a very crude bas-relief of stone, comprising a hideous picture of in some cryptic writing, and so far as he could tell, it was a rough parallel in all essential features of the bestial thing now lying before the meeting. This data, received with suspense and astonishment by the assembled members, proved doubly exciting to Inspector Legras, and he began at once to ply his informant with questions. Having noted and copied an oral ritual among the swamp cult worshippers his men had arrested, he besought the professor to remember as best he might the syllables taken down amongst the diabolist Eskimo. There then followed an exhaustive comparison of details, and a moment of really odd silence when both detective and scientist agreed on virtual identity of the phrase common to two hellish rituals so many worlds of distance apart. Louisiana and Greenland, they're far apart, but not worlds apart. They're on the same hemisphere. Same quarter hemisphere, both north and west. Anyways. Where was I? There we go. What, in substance, both the Eskimo wizards and the Louisiana swamp priests had chanted to their kindred idols was something very like this, the word divisions being guessed at from traditional breaks in the phrase as chanted aloud. Okay, let's give this a red hot go. Bingle, Bing enough, Cthulu relay, Wagad Nagafo Fatagan. I think that was pretty good. I'm pretty happy with how that came out. Legras had one point in advance of Professor Webb, for several among his mongrel prisoners had repeated to him what older celebrants had. Wow, that's rude. Calling prisoners mongrels? Alright. Had repeated to him what older celebrants had told them the words meant. This text, as given, ran something like this. In his house at Relais, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Interesting. I was looking at how Cthulhu and Relais are turned around in order, and wondering what else the ward order has changed in. How else the ward order has changed. That was a weirdly said sentence. Lovecraft got me talking backwards. And now, in response to a general and urgent demand, Inspector Legras related as fully as possible his experience with the swamp worshippers, telling a story to which I could see my uncle attach profound significance. It savored of the wildest dreams of myth makers and theologians. It disclosed an astonishing degree of cosmic imagination among such half-caste and pariahs as... What the hell does half-caste mean? And pariahs as might be expected to possess it. On November 1st, 1907, there had come to New Orleans police a frantic summons from the swamp and lagoon country of the South. The squatters there, mostly primitive, but good-natured descendants of Lafitte's? Does he mean Lafayette? Lafitte's men were in the grip of stark terror from an unknown thing, which had stolen... Okay, I'm sorry, calling them primitive, like, okay, yeah, maybe back then. I don't know. It's just a weird assumption to make from a New Englander. Damn New Englanders. Racist-ass Yanks. Anyways, we're gonna gloss over that. We're in the grip of stark terror from an unknown thing which had stolen upon them in the night. It was voodoo, apparently, but voodoo of a more terrible sort they had ever known, and some of their women and children had disappeared since the malevolent tom-tom had begun its incessant beating far within the black-haunted woods where no dweller ventured. I mean, black-haunted swamps, not woods. Anyways, there were insane shouts and harrowing, soul-chilling chants and dancing devil flames, and the frightened messenger added, the people could stand it no more. So a body of 20 police, filling 2 carriages and an automobile, had set out in the late afternoon, and the shivering squatter as a guide. At the end of the passable road, they alighted, and for miles splashed on in silence through the terrible cypresses woods where days never came. Ugly roots and malignant hanging nooses of Spanish moss beset them. Some good imagery with the Spanish moss nooses. And now and then a pile of dank stones or fragment of rotting wall intensified by its hint of morbid habitation, a depression in which every malformed tree and every fungus islet combined to create. At length, the squatter settlement, a miserable huddle of huts, hove in sight. Hove. And hysterical dwellers ran out to cluster around the group of bobbing lanterns. The muffled beat of tom-toms was now faintly audible far, far ahead, and a curdling shriek came at infrequent intervals when the wind shifted. A reddish glare, too, seemed to filter through the pale undergrowth beyond endless avenues of forest night. Reluctant to even be left alone again, each one of the cowed squatters refused to point blank to advance another inch toward the scene of unholy worship, so Inspector Legras and his 19 colleagues plunged on unguided into black arcades of horror that none of them had ever trod before. Lovecraft is a wordy motherfucker. The region now entered by the police was one of traditionally evil repute. Wordy motherfucker. Substantially unknown and untraversed by white men. There were legends of a hidden lake unglimpsed by... Okay, Lovecraft just doesn't know the South. If he thinks whiteys aren't down in the swamps too. Where was I? There were legends of a hidden lake unglimpsed by mortal sight, in which dwelt a huge, formless white polypus thing? Cancerous thing? Polypus thing with luminous eyes, and squatters whispered that bat-winged devils flew up out of caverns in inner earth to worship it at midnight. They said it had been there before Delborville, before LaSalle, before the Indians, and before even the wholesome beasts and birds of the woods. It was nightmare itself, and to see it was to die, but it made men dream, and so they knew enough to keep away. Present voodoo orgy was indeed on the merest fringe of this abhorred area, but that location was bad enough. Hence perhaps the very place of the worship had terrified the squatters more than the shocking sounds and incidents. Only poetry or madness could do justice to the noises heard by Legras's men as they plowed on through the black morass toward the red glare and the muffled tom-toms. There are vocal qualities peculiar to men, and vocal qualities peculiar to beasts. It is terrible to hear the one when the source should yield to the other. Animal fury and orgiastic license here whipped themselves to demonic heights by howls and squawking ecstasies that tore and reverberated through those nighted woods like pestilential tempests from the gulfs of hell. Now and then, the less organized ululation would cease. Ululation would cease, and from what seemed a well-drilled chorus of hoarse voices, would rise and sing-song chant that hideous phrase or ritual. Okay, let's give this another go. Pitungli, Megalonaf, Cthulu Relay, Waga, Nagel, Fatagan. Then the men, having reached a spot where the trees were thinner, came suddenly in sight of the spectacle itself. 4 of them reeled, 1 fainted, and 2 were shaken into a frantic cry which the mad cacophony of the orgy fortunately deadened. Legras stashed swamp water on the face of the fainting men, and all stood trembling and nearly hypnotized with horror. In the natural glade of the swamp stood a grassy island of perhaps an acre's extent, clear of trees and tolerably dry. On this now leaped and twisted a more indescribable horde of human abnormality than any but a Sime or an Angarola could paint. Maybe those are schools of artists. I don't know. Void of clothing, this hybrid spawn were braying bellowing and writhing about a monstrous ring-shaped bonfire, in the center of which, revealed by occasional rifts in the curtain of flame, stood a great granite monolith some 8 feet in height, on top of which, incongruous with its diminutiveness, there we go, rested the nauseous carven statuette. From a wide circle of 10 scaffolds, set up at regular intervals, with the flame-girt monolith as a center hung, head downward, the oddly marred bodies of the helpless squatters who had disappeared. It was inside the circle that the ring of worshippers jumped and roared, the general direction of the mass motion being from left to right, an endless bacchanal between the ring of bodies and the ring of fire. It may have been only imagination, and it may have been only echoes which induced one of the men, an excitable Spaniard, to fancy he heard antiphonal responses to the ritual from some far and unillumined spot deeper within the wood of ancient legendary and horror. This man, Joseph D. Galvez, I later met and questioned, and he proved distractingly imaginative. He indeed went so far as to hint of the faint beating of great wings, and of a glimpse of shining eyes and a mountainous white bulk beyond the remotest trees. But I suppose he had been hearing too much native superstition. Actually, the horrified pause of the men was native superstition. You mean the voodoo cult who aren't native because Africans were Lovecraft? Whatever, moving on. I don't want to get into it. Actually, the horrified pause of the men was of comparatively brief duration. Duty came first, and although there must have been nearly 100 mongrel celebrants in the throng, the police relied on their firearms and plunged determinedly, I don't know if that's the right word, into the nauseous rout. For 5 minutes, the resultant din and chaos were beyond description. Wild blows were struck, shots were fired, and escapes were made, but in the end, Legras was able to count some 47 stolen prisoners, whom he forced to dress in haste and fall into line between 2 rows of policemen. 5 of the worshippers lay dead, and 2 severely wounded ones were carried away on improvised stretchers by their fellow prisoners. The image of the monolith, of course, was carefully removed and carried back by Legras. Examined at headquarters after a trip of intense strain and weariness, the prisoners all proved to be men of a very low, mixed-blooded, and mentally aberrant type. Okay. Nasty Yank. Lovecraft. Most were seamen. And a sprinkling of gentlemen. Oh yeah. I forgot for a second that gentleman is the censor there. And a sprinkling of gentlemen and mulattoes, which is no, I think that's just the proper word for that, even though itself is kind of racist. I don't think I mean anything could be used in a racist tone, but I don't remember if mulatto is racist. It's been so long since I heard that. Since the 90s. It probably would be racist these days. I shouldn't say it. Just in case. Anyways. Largely West Indians, or Brava Portuguese from... Are they Portuguese an inferior race to Lovecraft? They're just Spanish neighbors. The hell? Or maybe Brava Portuguese are specific people. From the Cape Verde Islands, gave a coloring of voodooism to the heterogeneous cult. But before many questions were asked, it became manifest that something far deeper and older than gentleman fetishism was involved. Degraded and ignorant as they were, the creatures held with surprising consistency to the essential idea of their loathsome faith. Thank God I went ahead and edited this PDF. They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones, who lived ages before there were any men, and who came to the young world out of the sky. Those old ones were gone now, inside the earth and under the sea, but their dead bodies had told their secrets and dreams to the first men, who formed a cult which had never died. This was that cult, and the prisoners said it had always existed and always would exist, hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world, until the time when the great priest Cthulhu, from his dark house in the mighty city of R'lyeh, under the waters, should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway. Some day he would call, when the stars were ready, and the secret cult would always be waiting to liberate him. Meanwhile, no more must be told. There is a secret which even torture could not extract. Mankind was not absolutely alone among the conspicuous things of earth, for shapes came out of the dark to visit the faithful few. But these were not the great old ones. No man had ever seen the old ones. The carven idol was great Cthulhu, but none might say whether or not the others are precisely like him. No one could read the old writing now, but things were told by word of mouth. The chanted ritual was not the secret. That was never spoken aloud, only whispered. The chant meant only this. In his house at R'lyeh, whatever. Dead Cthulhu waits streaming. Only 2 of the prisoners were found sane enough to be hanged, and the rest were committed to various institutions. All denied a part in the ritual murders and averred that the killing had been done by black-winged ones, which had come to them from their immemorial meeting place in the haunted woods. But of those mysterious allies, no coherent account could ever be gained. What the police did extract came mainly from an immensely aged mestizo, named Castro, who claimed to have sailed to strange ports and talked with undying leaders of the cult in the mountains of China. Hell is a mestizo? Old Castro remembered bits of hideous legend that paled the speculations of theologists and made men in the world seem recent and transient indeed. Goddamn wordy. There had been aeons when other things ruled on the earth, and getting stilted there with my speech from talking too much. Other things ruled on the earth, and they had great cities. Remains of them, he said the deathless Chinamen had told him, were still to be found as Cyclopean stones on islands in the Pacific. They all died vast epochs of time before men came, but there were arts which could revive them when the stars had come around again to the right positions in the cycle of eternity. They had indeed come themselves from the stars and brought their images with them. These great old ones, Castro continued, were not composed altogether of flesh and blood. They had shape, for did not this star-fashioned image prove it? But that shape was not made of matter. When the stars were right, they could plunge from world to world through the sky, but when the stars were wrong, they could not live. But although they no longer lived, they would never really die. They all lay in stone houses in their great city of R'lyeh, preserved by the spells of mighty Cthulhu, for a glorious resurrection when the stars and the earth might once more be ready for them. But at that time, some force from outside must serve to liberate their bodies. The spells that preserved them intact likewise prevented them from making an initial move, and they could only lie awake in the dark and think whilst uncounted millions of years rolled by. They knew all that was occurring in the universe, but their mode of speech was transmitted thought. Even now, they talked in their tombs. When, after infinities of chaos, the first men came, the great old ones spoke to the sensitive among them by molding their dreams, for only thus could their language reach the fleshly minds of mammals. Excuse me. Then, whispered Castro, those first men formed the cult around small idols which the great ones showed them. Idols brought in dim eras. Eras? Eras from dark stars. Maybe it meant eras from dark stars. That cult would never die till the stars came right again, and the secret priest would take great Cthulhu from his tomb to revive his subjects and resume his rule of Earth. The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves, and all the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. Meanwhile, the cult, by appropriate rites, must keep alive the memory of those ancient ways and shadow forth the prophecy of their return. In the elder time, chosen men had talked with the entombed old ones in dreams, but then something had happened. The great stone city of Relais, with its monoliths and sepulchres, had sunk beneath the waves and the deep waters, full of the one primal mystery through which not even thought can pass, had cut off the spectral intercourse. The memory never died, and High Priest said that the city would rise again when the stars were right. Then came out of the earth the black spirits of earth, moldy and shadowy, and full of dim rumors picked up in caverns beneath forgotten sea bottoms. But of them old Castro dared not speak much, cut himself off hurriedly, and no amount of persuasion or subtlety could elicit more in this direction. The size of the old ones, too, he curiously declined to mention. Of the cult, he said that he thought the center lay amid the pathless deserts of Arabia, where Iram, the city of pillars. Oh, Iram. The city of pillars. Huh. So that's where Uncharted 3 got that from. Dreams hidden and untouched. It was not allied to the European witch cult. It was virtually unknown beyond its members. No book had ever really hinted of it, though the Deathless Chinaman said that there were double meanings in the Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, which the initiated might read as they chose, especially the much-discussed couplet. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons, even death may die. Legrasse, deeply impressed and not a little bewildered, had inquired in vain concerning the historic affiliations of the cult. Castro, apparently, had told the truth when he said that it was wholly secret. The authorities at Tulane University could shed no light upon either cult or image, and now the detective had come to the highest authorities in the country and met with no more than the Greenland tale of Professor Webb. How much longer is this? Because it's getting late. My throat's starting to hurt. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and call it here because we got a few more pages before the next part. So this is page 247, paragraph 3. Make a note of that. 237, paragraph 3. The feverish. Okay. We will continue this probably Thursday, but I might just want to play Helldivers Thursday. We'll find out. Tomorrow, I will either be playing Helldivers or more of the Starship Troopers DLC. Expansion DLC thing. Either way. I kind of just want to play Helldivers because obviously I'm into it. It's fun again. But hope you all have a fantastic Wednesday. I will see you at 1:30 tomorrow night. Take care, everyone. Oh, also, almost forgot. Helldivers Quest Drop 3 is up since yesterday. It will run until this coming Monday. You can vote by liking the comment underneath the video with what you want to happen next. So with that, take care, everyone. Have a great Wednesday.